Hello, welcome to my channel. Today I'll be going over the process of this acrylic painting. This piece was commissioned by my parents as a birthday gift for their friend who invited them on a trip to Alaska a few months back. Those friends treat my parents really well, so my parents wanted a special gift to express how grateful they are for them. Even before the trip, they pitched the commission to me and asked for ideas, so I suggested that they take some photos during the trip and we'd go from there. They ended up getting some great shots during a boat ride, so that's what I referenced for this piece. Before jumping straight into acrylic, I decided to do a gouache study. In the past, I didn't really do thumbnails or anything of my pieces, but lately I found that it is helpful to do that to solidify big picture elements. And on to painting. When I do acrylic paintings, I tend to start off with a dark underpainting since I find that it helps get rid of any white that would peek through the subsequent layers. Something I think looks really incomplete is seeing white between the elements of your painting, such as around trees or water. Sometimes when painting, it kind of feels like you're trying to color inside the lines and not let things touch, so having some base colors beneath that helps hide that effect. Plus, using dark colors helps to establish depth in shadow areas. It's fine if the colors don't match exactly with the foreground elements, since you'll cover most of it up anyway. I then roughly sketch in the big elements like the mountains and waves. You can see that I have no problem painting light layers back on top of dark because acrylic is opaque, unlike watercolor for example. This is what it looks like after those initial first layers. The key compositional elements are in place, and the shadow and highlight areas are roughly defined. Sometimes I think my quick gouache sketches would be considered done at this point. So here I've added in some highlights to the mountains and started building up the clouds. Sorry, I cut out the footage where I added in the initial mountain highlights since the lighting was really bad. Anyway, I really like how I did those mountain highlights, but as you'll see later, I ended up blending them down a bit. After I finished and looked back at this section of the painting, I was kind of sad that my later version lost the color contrast I had here. I wanted to create more nuanced shadows to better match the reference photo, but I actually regret doing that. Oh well, you'll live and you'll learn. This is where I started messing with the highlights and shadows in the mountains. I wanted to use blues for the shadows and yellows for the highlights. This way of using color temperature for shadows and highlights is, in my opinion, a fun way to add visual interest to your dark and light areas. Instead of only using value, that is, a darker or lighter version of the same color, pick a cool color for the shadows and a warm color for the highlights. This reminds us that the warm area is being warmed by sunlight while the cool area is staying cooler in the shade. It's something I want to experiment more with in my paintings. Here I'm defining the wakes a bit more. The challenging part of this was getting the direction to look right. Parts of that middle section seem to fan out from the center, but overall it should still look like a smooth piece. I wanted to make sure I didn't paint the smaller wake lines parallel to each other since they fan out too. One of the chunks on the right is from a different reference photo, and I chose to add it in since I thought it made the piece look more interesting. I feel like I've painted water a lot in the past, but I don't think I've done something like this before. Luckily, with organic elements, you don't need to replicate the exact shapes. As long as the movement and placement mostly feel right, it will probably look fine. Looking back at the process of this piece, there are many sections where I'm watching and thinking, wow, I could have called it done right there. One question artists have to answer every time they make something is this piece 100% done yet? I think the answer is never yes, as there's always more detail you could add or elements you could fix. However, it's important to know when to stop because at some point you'll end up overworking your piece and ruining it. Like I said earlier, I kind of wish I kept in the highlights on the mountains rather than blending them down. Each time you make something, it's a delicate balance between adding just enough detail to make the piece look complete, but not too much that it looks overworked. Interestingly enough, I think I tend to stop too early in my pieces because usually I'm too lazy to properly add in detail. Like here. Originally I didn't want to add in these effects since I liked how the piece was turning out without them, but I decided that they made this particular composition special since it was the spray coming off the boat my parents were on. To get this effect, I grabbed a fan brush and went at it. I rarely ever use this sort of brush, but it produced an interesting effect, so I think I'll experiment with it more in the future. The thing I wanted to pay attention to here was the direction of the spray. In the photo it looked pretty even and not directional. You can see that I was experimenting with thickness and direction in my strokes. The first pass didn't quite turn out how I wanted, so I wiped it off and tried it again. The nice thing about acrylic is that once it's dry, you won't be able to reactivate a previous layer, so you don't have to worry about ruining your previous work if you want to mess around with effects like these. I actually want to talk about my feelings on acrylic painting since it's been so long since I've done one. Thinking back, the last one I properly completed was back in 2017 when I painted the gem temple from Steven Universe. I pulled my supplies out in 2020, intending to paint something from Final Fantasy VII Remake, but couldn't quite get into the groove. For whatever reason, acrylic paintings always felt like a huge commitment for me. It could be because the first time I did a proper acrylic painting was during my junior year of high school in my drawing and painting class. That painting was an entire unit, so I think we spent weeks on it. At the time, it was by far the best piece of art I had ever created in my life. Honestly, I still think it's one of my best works, so much so that I actually sell prints of it in my shop and at conventions. Side note, there's a link to it in the description box if you're interested in prints. It makes me happy when people buy it because it feels like all the time and love I poured into it has paid off. It was one of those pieces where everything clicked. I really enjoyed the process while working on it, and the end result matched or even exceeded the expectations I had in my head. Maybe because of this, acrylic painting to me became something I placed on a very high pedestal. If I wanted to work on an acrylic painting, it would have to be the next best thing I ever painted, ever. On top of that, the size of the canvas, the fear of wasting materials, and the hassle of setting everything up made me really want to not fail. The first painting I did was on a 16x20 canvas, which feels like a much bigger commitment than a page in a sketchbook. If I was going to spend time working on a piece that would take up so much physical space to work on and display, it better be amazing. But the downside of that is there's no room for bad art pieces or practice sketches. If I wasn't able to get into the groove of the painting or figure out what was going wrong, I'd simply set it aside to revisit later, then never revisit it later. I didn't know how to push through the ugly stage of a painting since I never really made room for myself to make ugly acrylic paintings. So after my last acrylic attempt in 2020, I ended up trying out gouache because at that time I had been mainly working in watercolor, so switching to gouache didn't seem like it'd be that big of a jump. Experimenting with gouache created the space I needed to figure out how to push through the ugly stages or make bad art. It reminded me that not every painting I make will turn out gallery ready, and that's okay. I found that my approach to doing gouache landscapes was similar to that of my acrylic ones, and that sometimes I would build out base or shadow layers first and then work on the highlights in less watery layers. Because I could do a lot of quick iterations, I was able to work on things that challenged or scared me, such as clouds or buildings. I let myself attempt painting those whether they turn out good or bad, which in turn resulted in me gaining confidence in my approach of those elements. When I jumped back into acrylic this time around, I found that so many things were much easier than before, and I didn't have to deal with some things that make gouache a struggle. For example, the dry shift in acrylic is not nearly as drastic as that in gouache. It was amazing being able to see my wet colors look basically the same, mixed, as when they dried. I also didn't have to worry about re-wetting layers on the canvas like I would with gouache, so my white areas were much cleaner. On top of that, because I had gotten a lot of practice with landscapes, I was able to lay down my initial layers super fast. So what was my main takeaway? Well, basically, sometimes stepping away for a while is the right move. If you're stuck in one area, do something else for a bit, learn from that, then try applying what you learned to the thing you were stuck on. Maybe you'll go in with a new approach and something will click this time around. Working on this piece showed me that acrylic is a lot less intimidating than I kept thinking it was, and it doesn't have to be that time consuming either. This piece probably took me like 10 to 12 hours in total, which is a lot less than several weeks like in my high school piece. I do have a lot of unfinished canvases sitting around, so I'm ready to bust them out and experiment a bit. If they end up being good pieces, awesome. If not, I'll just paint over them and try again. Thank you so much for watching and listening to me ramble. I hope you learned something. I'm actually open for commissions right now, so check out the link in the description if you're interested in something like this. As always, I appreciate you for watching and commenting, and I hope to see you next time.